Many of the structures we use to organize modern society are actually Roman. The concept of a senate, the legal weight of a veto, and the framework of a republic are all holdovers from an empire that reached its peak 2,000 years ago. By the year 476 AD, that entire world was ending. The city of Rome was engulfed in fire as Germanic tribes dismantled the infrastructure of the Western Empire beat by beat. This was the first modern global superpower. To understand how it ended up in ruins, we have to look past the invaders at the gates and examine the machinery of the empire itself. The violent collapse seen in the 5th century was the final stage of a much longer process. To find the source of the decay, we have to look at the very systems that made Rome powerful in the first place. In 625 BC, Rome consisted of a few vulnerable trading villages scattered along the Tiber River. These early Romans were forced to unite to defend themselves against constant raids from their more powerful neighbors. In 509 BC, the population revolted against their tyrant kings and established the Roman Republic. This new government centered on the Senate, a ruling body designed to balance the influence of the wealthy elite with the needs of the working class. This political stability allowed Rome to project military power across the Mediterranean. They engaged in a series of total wars against Carthage, eventually erasing their greatest rival from the map. These stone ruins in North Africa are all that remain of a civilization Rome systematically dismantled to secure its own dominance. By 100 BC, these victories had funneled unprecedented amounts of gold, grain, and enslaved labor into the capital. Rome had evolved into a superpower, with a reach that stretched from Spain to the edges of the Middle East. However, the Republic was designed to govern a city, not a hemisphere. The sudden influx of extreme wealth and the sheer scale of the new territories began to overwhelm the Senate's ability to maintain order. As new wealth poured in, the gap between the elite and the poor widened. Political instability followed, leading to a period where senators frequently used assassination to silence any politician who advocated for land reform or aid for the impoverished. Julius Caesar leveraged this instability to build a personal power base. His conquest of Gaul resulted in the death or enslavement of millions, providing him with a personal fortune that made him more powerful than the state he served. Caesar eventually ignored the Senate's authority, crossed the Rubicon with his legions, and defeated his rival Pompey. By declaring himself dictator for life, he effectively ended the centuries-old tradition of shared republican power. In 44 BC, a group of senators killed Caesar in an attempt to restore the republic. Instead, his death triggered a decade of civil war that further exhausted Rome's resources and shifted the public's loyalty away from elected officials. The rapid growth of the empire had outpaced its laws. Because the state could no longer provide stability, the Roman legions became loyal to individual generals who could pay them, rather than the government in Rome. Caesar's heir, Octavian, took the name Augustus and established himself as the first emperor. He began a 200-year period of relative stability known as the Pax Romana. But this peace came at a specific structural cost. The safety of the Mediterranean world now rested on the competence of a single individual. This created a recurring crisis. When the emperor was capable, the empire flourished. When he was unstable, the entire system suffered. The limits of this system were tested by leaders like Caligula, whose erratic behavior led to his murder by his own guards. Decades later, Nero's financial mismanagement and focus on personal projects left the Roman treasury empty and the provinces on the verge of revolt. Even during the reigns of the good emperors like Marcus Aurelius, the threat of an army-led coup was constant. This bronze statue captures the peak of imperial authority, yet shortly after his death, the empire faced a century of near-constant internal warfare. A system that relies on the personality of a ruler rather than the strength of its institutions is inherently fragile. As the pool of competent leaders thinned, the cracks in the imperial framework became impossible to ignore. Following the death of Marcus Aurelius, Rome entered a century of total chaos. More than 25 emperors were installed and assassinated in rapid succession, often ruling for only a few weeks before the military turned on them. In a desperate attempt to make the empire governable, Emperor Diocletian legally split the territory into two halves. This division created a Western Empire managed from Italy and an Eastern Empire managed from Byzantium. The two regions immediately began to drift apart. The East controlled the most profitable trade routes and remained wealthy, while the West faced a shrinking tax base and a collapsing currency. Emperor Constantine later attempted to use Christianity to provide a new cultural glue for the state. While his religious reforms were lasting, they could not fix the underlying economic reality of a divided empire. Splitting the empire isolated the West from the resources of the East. Without the wealth of the Greek provinces, the Western government could no longer afford to maintain the borders or pay the legions required to keep the territory secure. By the 5th century, the Western Empire was a target for any organized force. Germanic tribes, like the Goths and Vandals, began a series of large-scale migrations into Roman territory, finding little resistance from a bankrupt government. These tribes eventually reached the capital, sacking the city of Rome and destroying the very infrastructure that had sustained the empire for 1,000 years. The end came in 476 AD. The final Western emperor, Romulus, was deposed by a Germanic general and sent into exile. The political entity that had dominated the West for centuries simply ceased to function. The collapse of Rome suggests that external threats were often the symptom of a much deeper decline. Internal greed, centuries of civil war, and the inability to manage its own geographic scale left the empire vulnerable. When the invaders finally arrived, they were pushing against a structure that had already been hollowed out from within.